All right, for this section, we're going to be dealing with a lot of technology, and we're going to be dealing with a lot of business. Overall, we're going to be looking at industrialization. Massive industrialization takes place here in America in the last sort of few decades of the 19th century, where industrialization had begun, mechanization had begun in the United States prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, they had mushrooms. Okay, the United States goes up to being the #1 industrial power in the world by 1900. And so we're going to be looking at some specific ones, especially we're going to talk about the railroads. The railroads really just radically alter everything, a lot of the business practices, a lot of the major inventions. But we're also going to look at then the social impact, one from the side of the people that are running these businesses, and then we're going to flip it around and we're going to look at it from the point of view of the people who are working, the workers of these businesses. And so we're going to be talking about this as well. Like I mentioned, industrialization was not something that started after the Civil War, but in a lot of ways it really hadn't even been happening, for the most part, prior to the Civil War. When you compare how massively it expands following the war between the states, all right? So this massive expansion of the industry that takes place in the post-war period is built upon a bunch of factors, all right, that also expanded during the last decades of the 19th century, right? Some of the things that you've got to have are all going to come together right at the right time, right? And that is, one, you've got to have resources necessary for large-scale industry. They become available and affordable. A good example of these are going to be steel and oil. Both of these existed. Both of these existed prior to the Civil War. The Romans could make steel, all right? The problem was it was too expensive. A lot of things that are out there we don't use, not because we can't make them, but it's not affordable for everybody to have one, all right? So steel and oil, which you're going to have for massive scale industrialization, if it doesn't exist in quantities that are cheap enough for you to afford, it doesn't matter what's out there. Okay. You also have to have a solution for labor. You've got to have enough workers to crank out enough product in order to industrialize, to work at these factories, but they also have to be willing to work for low enough to make it affordable. And while we always are happy when people make a lot of money, if it's too expensive to pay the workers and it raises the cost of your product so much that average people can't afford to buy it, then nobody's going to work. You're not going to hire anybody because you say, well, I have to pay the workers too much. So what you're going to see is this low-wage labor force is going to expand massively, largely due to this new wave of immigrants arriving from a couple of locations. One is going to be outside of America, mostly from Europe. We'll also talk about large-scale Asian immigration when we get on later in the semester. But we're also going to see rural in-migration, people moving as the farms begin to mechanize. They're going to be moving from the farmland to the urban spaces to take advantage of the fact that they need jobs now in the cities. So those are going to serve as our labor pools. And so this is industrialization. This is going to be Americans that are going to be working in these factories, giant machines, giant turning sort of metal wheels, great big baskets made out of steel. And so this is what they're going to be dealing with here in the late 19th century. One of the important game changers when we're dealing with these two, and these aren't the only two, but the two major resources of oil and steel, the first of these is going to be the Bessemer process. All right? For those of you who don't know anything about metal, all right, steel is like iron, only like 10,000 times better. All right? It is lighter, it's less likely to crack and break, it's less likely to rust, it's a lot stronger, and so you would say, well, why don't you use steel instead of iron? Because if you look, a lot of the machinery, a lot of the railroads, a lot of all this stuff was made out of iron, and it would rust and it would kind of fall apart, and then you have to replace it. The reason for that is because steel was too expensive. It wasn't that they didn't know how to make it. Prior to the Bessemer process, the way that you would make steel, you had these great big vats, maybe as big as this room, and you'd fill it up with this iron, and you boil it. Now, for those of you who think about it, how do you boil iron? There you go, melt it down, and then as it's boiling, all the impurities sort of float to the surface, and you sort of rake it with this scaff, and you sling it off in the slag pile so that the rim of this cauldron has these guys that are stripped to the waist, these muscular dudes, and they're slinging it. It's time-consuming. It requires a lot of human labor. It's very expensive. So there were a few things you did have to have steel for, and you could get it, but you were going to pay through the nose. And so it was actually cheaper, in many cases, to buy iron, wait for it to break, and then buy a replacement. So the Bessemer process is going to change this, because basically what you meant was you got rid of the old smelting process, and you would then use jets of heated air to basically heat up these individual pieces of iron and blast the impurities off of it, greatly reducing the amount of human labor and time required to make steel, and thus massively, massively reducing the cost. Okay? So now business people can buy and use steel in basically every facet of American life, and it's going to radically reshape just everything. It made certain things bigger and cheaper than they had been before, like the railroads and machinery for factories, but it's also going to make some things that hadn't been possible with iron possible now, like these long suspension bridges, skyscrapers in cities, and things like that. So when you look at this, this is some of the Bessemer process. This is the jets of hot air and machinery that's going on in the background with this. This gives you an idea of kind of how some of the equipment worked itself out. You don't need nearly the same amount of labor that's going to take place. Eventually, even the Bessemer process would be updated with another process that would be even faster and even more efficient. And so these are the steel mills as they're beginning with this as well. This is the Brooklyn Bridge. Prior to that, the only way to get across the East River was you went in a boat, or you swam. I don't know. So that was the only way to get across. So you've got a large amount of goods. You got to stop. You got to wait at the edge, and somebody's going to ferry you across. You're going to pay them a fee. All right. Now all of a sudden, because steel is long enough and strong enough and can be used in these suspension bridges, is this guy Roebler is able to make this long bridge. It's able to go across, and you can just move move back and forth as much as you want across this. And now, if you've been to any basically American city, or you've even gone on the interstate, the idea that you've got steel reinforced bridges to span mostly bodies of water, but also chasms and ditches and things like that, whatever undulation of the ground you're trying to get over, that all makes this possible. And of course, when you look at the skyline of New York, its number one use, of course, is providing large gorillas an opportunity to fight biplanes with this as well. But skyscrapers don't work without a steel endoskeleton. And so think about how stupid King Kong would be if he had to fight, like guys on the ground. I mean, you just ruin the whole thing. So one of the other major parts of this is going to be oil. All right. Metal moving parts, they need lubrication. If you don't believe me, don't put any oil in your car for a while and then enjoy walking as you burn your engine up. All right? If you're going to take metal parts that are going to be moving in conjunction with each other, you've got to have some kind of lubrication. And we're going to see that the best economical supply for this is going to come from petroleum products. Oil is going to be the fuel of American freedom from then until today. For those of you who invent a hydrogen cell or something really wicked awesome, fine, but that's all still future stuff, even here in the 21st century. Right? But that was not always the case, okay? Oil, in American Indians, when colonists showed up in the 1600s, yeah, they knew where oil was. It bubbled up to the surface and it was gross and sticky. And yeah, you could burn it. But for the most part, it was hard to get, it was hard to find, and once you burned it, it was gone. So what we're going to see, though, is eventually some people are like, if it bubbles up from the ground and we want more of it, maybe we should go into the ground to get it, right? I have an idea. Basically what we'll do is we'll take a big metal straw and we'll stick it in the ground and we'll suck the oil out, right? Which, if you know anything about real life now, you'd be like, yeah, that's how you do it, right? I've seen enough, I paid attention to enough of my science classes to know that, yeah, that's what you do. You go and you Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or Texas or something like that, and you stick these big metal straws in the ground and you pump it out, right? Well, when Edwin Drake proposed this, a lot of people, laughed sort of off their bottoms at him. It was like, that's a crazy idea. You're never going to find enough oil to do this. Edwin Drake, though, drills for oil in western Pennsylvania and finds it, and begins pumping it out of these deep caverns and begins selling it, okay? Now, the oil not only can be refined into a lubricating fluid, but also into a heating oil. In fact, to this day, a lot of people in New England, the number one way to heat your home in the wintertime is with heating oil. You can use it as a lighting oil, kerosene, right? For a long, long time, kerosene lanterns were the number one fuel for how you lit your home prior to electricity. And for those of you who live in Florida like us, you keep a little kerosene lantern around the house for when hurricanes come and knock your power out. So this is, for a long time, number one sort of lighting fuel for a lot of people. You can also eventually use it for fuel oil, diesel and gasoline, which is going to enable the invention of the automobile right around 1885. The last sort of key piece of the automobile was not how you're going to get it to work. It was, what fuel can we use for this? It wasn't until, and a lot of people, they experiment with different things, and the only thing that really worked very well was diesel and gasoline. But how are we going to get enough of that? And so finally, by right around 1885, you'll see Gottlieb Daimler is going to come up with, yeah, we're going to use petroleum products, and that's what we're going to use to fuel it. And of course, that's what we still use to fuel them today, except for those of you who ride around golf carts, right? So this is Edwin Drake in his ridiculous hat, and this is his first oil pumping enterprise in western Pennsylvania. Not much to look at by today's standard, but it turns out to be wildly successful because he's able to sell a product that a lot of people want until eventually, this is a few years later. Oh yeah, it's serious business now where you've got oil wells and all these kind of operations going on to pump out as much oil as possible. And now we have an insatiable lust for petroleum products to where we pump it out of basically every place we can find it on Earth. This is Gottlieb Daimler. He is the inventor of the automobile. Somewhere around 1885 is when he finally kind of puts all the pieces together and gets it up and going. And you can see why the early automobiles were often referred to as horseless carriages, because that's what they did. They took the carriage, they just didn't attach a horse to the front, they put the engine underneath it, and you put a little steering wheel up front, and you just use it to cruise around town. And of course, this is Gottlieb Daimler, and this is the guys that are with him. And of course, they're using the automobile right from its outset. They're using it for its #1 purpose of all time, and that's not transportation. It's not getting goods to market. It's picking up chicks. Okay, so we've got to understand a lot about the railroad industry in order to understand why American business and society and industry and all, why does that undergo this radical change in the late 19th, early 20th century? And you can really lay a lot of it at the feet of the railroads. Railroads, no exaggeration, massive game changer. In a lot of ways, you've got American society before the railroads, and you've got American society after the railroads. You're going to be, hopefully your mind is going to be blown at how we reshaped really our lives around the railroad, all right? Nickname, of course, of this is the Iron Horse, right? And it eventually is going to come to completely dominate American industry. Everything for a long time in this post-war period was completely dependent upon the railroad. When you look at it from a business point of view, passenger loads are pretty high. People are using this to get around either on a local basis or on even sometimes a national kind of basis. But most importantly, all major products of the American economy use the railroads for transport. Cowboys are using the railroads to get their cattle to the market. The steel mills are using the railroads to get their girders to the market. The oil is going on the railroads. Railroads are doing basically all of the work of major transportation in America. The reason that this is possible is by the post-Civil War period, you've got an extensive railroad network, all right, that connected basically all major locales, all right? When you think about today, all right, think about all these places that you know, these places where people live that you can't get to by road. You can't drive your car there. Yeah, there aren't any, okay? There aren't any. You don't think of these places where, okay, when you go to this person's house, you have to stop at the end of the road and get out and walk like 5 miles across country. No, nobody lives there. You don't live in a place where a road doesn't go. I mean, yeah, if you're one of the super sort of rich people down in Orlando or whatever, you know, it's flying communities. But for most of the rest of us mere mortals, nobody lives where there aren't roads. The same thing is true here in the late 19th century for the railroads. Almost nobody lived off of the railroad, all right? Because the railroads affected the settlement patterns, all right? Because what they would do is as the railroads are coming into an area, if it connected your town grew because people wanted to live near where the railroads were so they could do business with people everywhere because the railroad network connected all the important places. But in some cases, I mean, the railroads aren't going to connect everywhere. And if your spot is bypassed, some of these places would disappear. Now, in some cases, you can use a couple of examples to kind of explain this. In some cases, places that had not existed before come into existence because of the railroads. Good example of this is two towns in Florida. All right, one of these is my hometown, Plant City, Florida. It was nowhere. There was nothing there. There were some people that were there hanging out there. I mean, they were sort of a farming community, but essentially, it's nothing. Okay, nothing there. And then in 1885, Henry B. Plant builds a watering station because he needs someplace in eastern Hillsborough County for his trains to stop to take on water. Well, when the trains stop, that's a place where you can have commerce with them. So the local farmers all of a sudden, hey, yeah, we can sell our product here, and we can do all this kind of stuff here. And yeah, the little local crop that they grow just sort of for fun, but everybody has it, so you can't sell it, strawberries. Now all of a sudden you can sell it to people in upstate New York and Ohio, Pennsylvania, and make lots of money. Because when snow is up to those people's belly buttons up there, you can sell them your strawberries for a lot of money. And all of a sudden, Plant City is an actual thing. They've got a store, they've got a depot, they've got hotels, they've got restaurants, they've got banks, they've got all this activity. And so essentially, it's a town that shouldn't be anything. But because the railroad comes through there and it stops, a town just generates out of nothing, basically. You flip it on the other side. You look in North Florida, this place called Olena. Olena was a pretty good-sized town. Several hundred people lived there, a little farming community. They had everything going for them. They were at a nice little intersection of the roads. But as the railroad's coming through, they're like, look, we can't stop at every single town. And eventually the railroads bypassed Olena. You can go to Olena now. It's a state park. You can jump in the Santa Fe River if you want to. But nobody lives there. It's gone. It's a ghost town. And they've got a few of the buildings still up. But this gives you an idea of how the railroad just radically reshaped where you lived and where you didn't live as a result of that. Here's the map of the railroads here by 1900 of how extensive this railroad network. The dark black lines are the major lines, and then you got the little black lines are the local lines. And you say, wait a minute, they're everywhere. Yeah, that's the way it goes with this. All right. And in fact, we're going to see that railroads are going to radically re-alter all of our society, not just the geography as well. It's going to affect American attitudes, life patterns, and of course, generally speaking, it's overall going to speed up a lot of people's lives due to the much faster form of travel and the need to be on a schedule. And this is true for both people and their products. One of the things that the railroads did was it standardized the nation's clocks to the same minute. Most cities in America at this prior to this railroad time would set their clocks at noon, because noon is the easiest part of the day to figure out what time it is just by looking at the sun. Is it straight overhead? Yep, it's noon. And so what they would do is they would have their church bells ring at noon and stuff like that, and then people they'd pull their pocket watches out and they'd say, okay, it's noon. It's easy to determine, right? Now, for those of you who know anything about science, you'll know that the Earth is round like a basketball, and that as it rotates, all right, cities that are a little bit further east are going to have noon before anybody else. And so if every city in America is setting its clocks to when noon is directly overhead, they're all going to come up with slightly different numbers. For example, it is noon in Boston, in terms of the sun, 8 minutes before it's noon in New York City. Who cares, right? Well, when you're running a railroad between Boston and New York, and you've got to tell people when exactly to be on the train as it's pulling out of the station, you've got to give them a schedule. 8 minutes makes a big difference. In fact, 1 minute makes a big difference between you being on the train, leaving the station, and you being running after the train as it's pulling out of the station, yelling frantically. So this was a nightmare for the railroad industry to use, and just say, okay, is that when you get off at 12:52, is that Boston time because you're coming from New York? Is that the local time, or is that the New York time? Or so the railroad company finally just said, screw it. All right, they came up with their own time, and it was called railroad time, and it was the minute. And they said noon in this whole time zone is all going to be at the same time, regardless of where exactly the sun is over you. And if you want to catch the train, you need to set your watch to our schedule. So that's essentially what people did, was they just got a hold of the railroad schedule, and they said, okay, whenever they say noon is, or whenever they say whatever time is, that's what time we're going to use. In fact, when you look at the way that the United States, people in the United States looked at time, it was very, very different. A lot of people who had pocket watches prior to the Civil War didn't even have a minute hand on it. Because, I mean, seriously, what kind of hopped up jerk would care what minute it is? If you look at Robert E. Lee's orders that he issues during the Civil War, he just rounded it to the nearest quarter hour. 10 1/4 a.m., 3 3/4 p.m., 5 1/2 p.m., or something like that. Because his watch apparently didn't have a minute hand on it. But you needed to know about what time the orders were issued, especially since if you got two sets of orders, well, which one came first, which one came second. So you didn't have to put a timestamp on it so that the people that were receiving orders would know what time they were issued. But I mean, if you round it to the nearest 15 minutes or so, which you can do just by looking at the hour hand, That's all you need, right? Well, now, like I said, minute makes a big difference between you being on the train and you being not on the train. And so now you've got a minute hand that you've got to keep track of in order to be able to be on time for these trains and to know exactly what time to be there, right? Now, for those of you who are saying, well, wait a minute, you can't put the entire nation on a time zone because the sun eventually is going to get so far out of whack that when the sun is coming up in the east, it's still like 4 a.m. In the Pacific, California, and so you can't tell people out in California when it's still really, really, really dark and they should still be asleep for another couple of hours that it's 7 a.m. So the railroads, though, are the ones that broke the nation up into 4 different time zones. The minute hand is still standardized. It's just the hour hand with Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific time zones. It would change the hour hand, so that way you didn't have to wake up at 4 in the morning and say that it was 7. But other than that, they did keep this all on their own schedule, and people had to conform to it. This is one from Alachua County in North Florida, to give you an idea of what the train schedule here in the late 1800s would look like. And these guys were on a tight schedule. It was going to be so many minutes between this stop and the other stop. They're going to stop for so many minutes, and then they're going to go here, and they're going to go there. And they had to adhere to this schedule because if you're going to catch the train, you need to be there at the right minute. And you need to be concerned about what minute it was, because this is a big deal if you want to get from one place to another. And in some cases, if you missed the train for that day, you missed the train for that day. And so, I need to get to the next town here. You missed that train. Okay, well, when's the next train? Tomorrow. So, a minute can make a big deal, a big difference. And this is one of these railroad watches. Not only this guy, that one of these conductors would have, not only does it have a minute hand on it, this guy's so anally retentive that he's actually got a second hand on here. So anyway, I think my phone does a stopwatch all the way down to like a 10th of a second or something like that. So that way I can, watch people run while I'm on my phone. This is a breakdown of the time zones. Most of you are familiar with that, give you an idea of kind of how that operates. One of the other major accomplishments here when we talk about railroads was the completion of the railroad network through the transcontinental railroad network. All right? The first major attempt had begun in 1862, and of course you've got the government involved. When you got the government involved, you got all kinds of screwy things, right? You got graft, you got corruption, people that are stealing, and of course the government is subsidizing these people but not the other people, blah, 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 blah. But eventually they'll get their sort of ducks in a row, and you're going to have private corporations that are going to come in and they're going to do this. And the tracks are going to start in Sacramento, out in California, connected to that railroad network, and they're going to work their way east. And they're going to then meet the tracks that are heading west from Omaha, Nebraska. All right. Now, both of these companies, in order to complete the first transcontinental railroad, they're going to be using cheap immigrant labor in order to accomplish the task. For the most part, it's going to be Irish immigrants and the ones heading west across the Great Plains. You're going to see a huge number of Chinese immigrants being used in the tracks that are heading east, and it's a huge amount of work. All right, the ones that are heading east from California, they've got the Rocky Mountains to contend with. They've got to go around some of them, over a few of the smaller ones, and then blast their way through some of the big ones. So it's a pretty big undertaking. And of course, the ones going across the Great Plains, you've just got this vast amount of distance that they're going to have to cover. They finally are going to meet in a place called Promontory, Utah, in 1869, in the first national media event. We're used to this kind of stuff now when things happen that you go to the TV or you turn on your internet or you look on your phone and you watch things as they're happening kind of live. This was the first one that they were able to do that. And of course, they didn't have TV back then. They did have a telegraph, and they were able to sort of send these little Kepi type messages back and say, "Oh, this is what's going on. Oh, they're almost ready to go." And they actually, people were gathered around telegraph offices all throughout the United States. Listening, waiting as they're, last rail's been put on, getting ready to put the spikes in. So anyway, they're enraptured watching this little telegraph needle go up and down. They even brought in a telegraph into President Grant's office. So he's just sitting there, watching this thing on his desk, President of the United States watching this thing tap. They actually went to such silly extremes as to attach one of the leads to the telegraph to the last spike and the other end of the lead to the hammer that the guy was going to use to hit it. And so every time he would hit the spike, the telegraph needle would tap. He hit it. He hit it again. So anyway, they went a little silly with it, at least by our standards. Eventually they complete the line, and what that meant was now you could go from coast to coast in the United States. All the major railroad networks are going to be completed by 1869. Now the financial backers, these guys are going to make millions, because if you wanted to go to coast, you had to give them your money. And this is going to inspire a lot of other people to do this. By 1893, the United States had 5 transcontinental railroads that would take you across the United States from north to south, heading across in this direction. So here you can see some of these Irish immigrants working on the railroad lines going westward through the Great Plains, and here you can see some of these Chinese immigrants as they're working their way through the Rocky Mountains on this end of the railroad line. Eventually the two would meet in the middle, and there you can see the two lines are coming together, and the workers are shaking hands, and they're passing around the alcohol, so they're having a grand time here at this major media event. Well, we should just all feel wonderfully good about ourselves and the railroads. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, all right? As a lot of these people are moving west to take advantage of the free land almost that the United States government is giving away, their plan to make these viable businesses was to use the rail's ability to connect the farmer to the market. They didn't have to get their product, their 160 acres of corn or whatever. They didn't have to get it to the market. They just had to get it to the railroad. Okay? And so what happens is a lot of these railroad owners wind up having a very tight control over an extremely vital infrastructural necessity, meaning you got to pay me, the railroad owner, whatever I charge to get your product to market. Otherwise, you got to sit there and watch it rot. Don't think that these guys don't understand the power that they have in this situation. And a lot of times they're going to charge very exorbitant rates for these farmers. They would give bonuses and discounts to the big carriers, such as the businesses and things like that. They would charge them less, and then they would charge the farmers more because they realized they had local monopolies. Early on, you won't see a lot of national railroad monopolies, but it doesn't matter how many railroad companies are operating in the United States if there's only one operating in the western part of Nebraska where your farm is. That one company has a monopoly, at least in your area, and you got to pay them whatever they charge if you want to get your products to market. Now, a lot of these guys understand that the control that they have, especially crossing state lines and operating in local areas, they don't want the government messing around with their business. And so in many cases, they bribe a lot of these local authorities. They come in, they got money, and they say, hey, you want money for your political campaigns, you want this kind of thing. And they would take this all the way up even to members of Congress. And they would say, look, don't get involved in us. You know, the nation's business runs on our rails. If you come in and you break us up and you cause all these problems, then guess what? America's economy is going to go in the tank. And also, you wave enough money in a politician's face, you're going to get their attention, because politicians are like whores, I guess. So, worse yet, many of these companies began to then work together as if they didn't have enough power and control. They began to say, hey, you know what? If we just all charge the same thing, we wouldn't have to worry about competing with each other, then we would make even more money, right? So this is what they begin to do. This is not legal today. For those of you who are like, I should do that when I go into business. That's a good way to wind up in jail, okay? So this is what they began to do here in the late 19th century. This guy right here in the middle, this is a political cartoon, so for those of you who think you see him standing on the railroad tracks, who is the guy that was like 50 feet tall back in the 1880s? He has a college in Tennessee named after him, because while he did make giant piles of money, he gave enough money to this college that they named the whole thing after him. And this is Vanderbilt. He had been a Commodore, so for those of you who are fans of the SEC, that's him with the wickedly ostentatious facial hair. But this is him, and he's got some of these lesser CEOs of these other railroad companies. You'll notice that he's standing on kind of the crossroads of these railroad tracks of America, and he's got the leashes on them, like they're sort of his pets. And they control the activities that go on this. And this is how a lot of Americans felt that these railroad companies were kind of beginning to monopolize their basic business. And so what you're going to see, though, is a lot of these farmers are really beginning, by the late 1800s, to make a lot of noise. And they're beginning to lose profits due to the spiraling costs of shipping their goods on the railroads, and the government's beginning again to investigate this, although it's going to be somewhat halted. It's going to be very easy for a lot of these farmers, when we talk about the populist movement and things like that, farmers to get their views voted into mostly rural states. When you see some of these areas in the West and in the South, they're going to put these people into power and say, hey, listen, when are you going to regulate the railroads? Well, you get enough people in these areas, okay, well, we've got enough votes now in the legislature to try to regulate the railroads. The problem is the railroads run across state lines. And that makes it then interstate commerce. And in Munn versus Illinois, the Supreme Court had to remind the state of Illinois that it's not your job, it's not the state's job to regulate interstate commerce. Congress is supposed to be doing that. And it doesn't matter how good your intentions are. Oh, well, we're for the farmers and we're for the people, and it doesn't matter. It's not your job. Congress has to do that. The reason it's in the Constitution is so that states don't start fighting each other over trade. You have to come together where the states come together, and that is in Congress. So finally in 1887, Congress is going to pass the Interstate Commerce Act, which is going to set up a commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Both of these, by the way, are still in effect today. And it sets up a commission to establish these fair rates for rail carriers, and then the ICC, it still does a bunch of other stuff. Basically, if you're doing transportation of goods across state lines, the ICC has a hand in making sure that it's fairly regulated, and you don't do the things that you're really not supposed to do. So, we also look into this era as one of the great ages of invention. There's a lot of stuff that is coming out at this point. We're very lucky, those of us that remember sort of the late 20th and the early 21st century. This is also another one of those great eras of invention. There's a bunch of cool stuff coming out, and it has been for quite some time. The late 19th century was a lot like that as well, right? And a lot of these very timely, very interesting, sort of inventions are going to radically reshape not only business, but also the way people live their lives, right? And so we'll go through and sort of look at some of these, right? Alexander Graham Bell, he's going to invent the telephone, which of course revolutionizes communications. You now have a direct line to physically talk to somebody else. You combine that technology with Marconi, with the radio, you get modern cell phones, modern mobile phones. The idea that you can just, well, I have something I need to say to somebody, and that you can just call them and tell them, and then they'll know. Well, that's just an assumption of life here in America. You just my entire life, that's what you do. We need to tell somebody something, or we need to ask somebody something. You just call them, and they're right there. Prior to that, that just didn't happen. Okay, you could send them a telegram, but that would take a while because you had to go down to the telegraph office, and then the telegraph office at the other end had to find the other person and give them the note. So the idea that you could just call people, and of course it's ridiculously expensive when it first gets started, but the costs continue to come down on this, and it's going to radically revolutionize communication. Eventually you apply the idea to computers. Hey, what would be cool is if we let computers talk to each other. You get the internet, okay? Now the most famous inventor of the era was Thomas Edison. Really, he's sort of the most famous thief because he invented some stuff, but he also really stole a lot of stuff from guys like Nikola Tesla and put a patent on it and things like that. But Edison, he gets the credit for this because while whether or not he necessarily invented a lot of the things that, the actual science kind of part of it, he did invent the business practices that made them possible for people to buy them. And he really needs to get a lot of credit for that. Most famous of these inventions is the light bulb, okay? And when you think about it for just a second, the light bulb is a great thing to think about and say, well, how does that change society? Oh, well, I come in, I turn the lights on. What do you think? Like people wandered around in the dark before they had light bulbs? No, that's not true, okay? So you just stop and you think about it for just a second. And you say, okay, you go down somewhere, and when the light bulb is like a new invention, circuses would get light bulbs, and they would advertise, we have electric lights. And you go down and you see these electric lights for the first time. Wow. Whoa. This is cool, right? It's a lot brighter, it's a lot more consistent than any of the lighting that you have in your house, either from kerosene or fire or a candle or whatever it is you get in your house. And so this is just amazing. Until you tell yourself, all right, that's it. I'm getting a light bulb. I'm going to have light bulbs for my house, and you go down to the store and you get light bulbs. Well, you can't just grab a light bulb and take it back to your house and stick it in the corner and wait for it to light up. Okay? You've got to have electricity to your house. All right? Well, Edison, fortunately, he invented the electric grid that makes that possible as well. So you've got to get workmen to come over, and they've got to fish the walls, and they've got to put electricity in your house. And so now you got to run the wire up, and then you got to put the switch in, and then you got to pay the electric company to send the electricity to your house via the electric grid. And so you get all this kind of stuff hooked up, and then now you finally walk over to the wall, and you flip the light on. Whoa. Amazing, right? Well, this is going to radically rechange your life. One of the things they noticed was Americans usually, prior to the light bulb, Americans usually spend about 10 hours in bed at night. One of the misconceptions is that Americans used to sleep for 10 hours. They didn't sleep for more than 8. They spent 10 hours in bed because it was too dark to do anything else. They would get up in the middle of the night. They would raid the icebox. They'd have sex. There was an hour or two in there where they're just like, yep, I'm awake. Nothing to do because it's too dark. Okay, but it has gone down to the amount of time that you spend in bed. This is 7 to 8 hours is what you're going to see now, because the light bulb effectively lights up the room. You also consider the fact that Chicago burnt to the ground allegedly because a kerosene lantern got kicked over by a cow, and all these wooden houses that are right next to each other all caught on fire. So you look at it like that and you say, man, electricity is a lot safer. But then once you have electricity in your house for the light bulb, you know what you have electricity in your house for? Everything else that runs on electricity. Stoves, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, eventually computers, iPods, all this kind of stuff that's going to run on electricity is all part and parcel with the light bulb. Okay? He's also going to invent a bunch of other things. The phonograph, which is basically a record player, so you can have music in your house. The mimeograph, which is going to be the early sort of form of the Xerox machine, which take an image and you can reproduce copies. And the moving pictures. He also invented the moving picture industry. The idea that you go to a theater and you pay money and you watch a movie and then you leave. Oh yeah, that's how things are. Not only do you invent the camera, but you invent the business practices that make that kind of possible. You're also going to see the advent of refrigeration from Birdseye, typewriters from Charles Sholes, the electric trolley car system, cash registers. So when you look at this period, by 1900 or so, if you're living in a city that has these amenities, you take a trolley car to work. You've got a form of public transportation. You take this trolley car to work. You go to your job, where maybe you talk to some people on the phone, and you get your work done. You type all this kind of stuff up on a typewriter, and then you go stop by the grocery store where you pay the person. They ring it up on a cash register. You go home at night. You grab the girl or the guy or whatever, and you go and you see a movie. That's a pretty modern kind of American life. You're shopping at the grocery store. I mean, it's not terribly different than what you might see today. So there's Alexander Graham Bell talking on the telephone. He's demonstrating this is in the 1870s for these people to show how it works. And of course, he's saying, "What do you mean I'm not wearing pants?" So anyway, this is the light bulb. Allegedly, one of the light bulbs that Edison first came up with still works from like the late 1800s. And the reason for that is if you went and tried to buy light bulbs today that never went bad, whenever you bought them, they'd be ridiculously expensive. So if you did, you're playing football in the house like your mom told you not to, and you break one, and you got to go and spend like $10 to get a new one, nobody would buy light bulbs. So it's actually better to have light bulbs that are cheap and flimsy and break, but you can pay to replace them every so often, than to have one big expensive bulb that you're never going to pay to replace. So anyway, that's just the business model with this. I also was reading a few months ago, there's like some firehouse, Philadelphia, Buffalo, something like that. It's got some light bulb that's on their wall that's been lit for like the past 100 and something years. So anyway, they don't all have to go bad, but if you want them to be affordable, then they need to. This is Thomas Alva Edison, like he lived most of his life looking like a big fat jerk. So this is with the phonograph. He's showing with this. If you've ever seen a record player, which probably a lot of people in their late teens and early 20s never have, but you had these flat sort of platters, and you had a needle that would play on it as it would rotate around. It's the same idea, you just had a cylinder. It was a cylinder, and it would rotate around, and the needle would pick up the sounds that were recorded on the wax cylinder with this as well. This looks like maybe a medieval torture device, but it's actually a mimeograph machine. This is an early version of the copy machine and how you would make these as well. This is an early motion picture camera. It works on the principle, if you've ever seen a flip book, where you sort of take drawings and you sort of flip them together, and it gives the illusion of motion, that's the way that it goes. You've got a whole bunch of these little cells all on the film, and as it goes through very, very quickly, it gives the illusion that things are moving. All right, I'm assuming that some of you at some point have been bored enough to play Monopoly. And if you played with your friends, they stop being your friends after that, because Monopoly is a good way to make you hate like everybody that you play with. But the essence of Monopoly is you've got to get all of one color, and then you can start building hotels and stuff on it and charging exorbitant rates. That's based on reality. All right. So when we look at this change of what's taking place in American business, we've got to talk about the advent of the monopoly system. All right. So when you look at all this, you kind of put it all together. The resources becoming available and affordable, the immigration providing the labor, the railroads providing the transportation, and the inventions providing kind of the products themselves, or in some cases the grease to keep the products moving. They really allow this industry to mushroom during this Gilded Age, this last part of the 1800s. Now, what's going to happen is almost all of these industries, various types of business, they settle into being dominated by either one person or a small cartel of businesses. For example, Carnegie dominated the steel industry. Vanderbilt's going to dominate the railroads. Rockefeller's going to be with oil. All right. Now, the reason that you would want to do this is once you, just like in the game Monopoly, if you're the only game in town, if you're the only one selling oil, for example, you can charge whatever you want. You can pay your workers whatever they want because you work in the oil industry. You got to work for me. And you don't like it? Tough. And so that was the way that it worked. And so you put everybody outside of business, so that way you were the only person running the show. All right? Now, a lot of people had problems with this, but business leaders actually argued in favor of this under a principle what they refer to as social Darwinism. All right? Now, just like Darwinism says that the survival of the fittest organisms, they pass on their genetic material to the next generation. In this case, in a business sense, the strongest businesses are going to survive. Businesses that are well-run, well-capitalized, they've got a good business model, they've got a good product, they're constantly bringing out things at a price that people want to buy, they're going to survive. The bad businesses, the ones that are run by blithering idiots, they're going to go under. And in fact, if the government gets involved by trying to regulate this, then it'll throw all of this off. Maybe a good business gets regulated or taxed into bankruptcy, and a business that's run by a buffoon is allowed to survive. And all of this then is going to hurt the American consumer. And you get guys like Rockefeller, who on the one hand is making money hand over fist, but he's also saying that the American working man needs oil. He needs oil, he needs kerosene, and he needs it at a price that he can afford, and they're going to get it to him. So, for those of you who just, you kind of want to sigh very easily on, well, these guys are rat bastards, and they're shameful kind of people. Or no, they're really, really good. They're doing all this great work, they're giving money to charity, and they're helping the American economy expand and give work. Both are true. Both are true. They're a curious mix of sort of good and evil when we consider this. All right? So we're going to look at a couple of case studies of how these guys build these, in this case, one-person monopolies. All right? The first of these is Andrew Carnegie. He's born of poor Scottish immigrants, didn't have any money, didn't have two dimes to rub together for a long time. Carnegie had gotten a job as a telegraph operator working for some company, and he was a hard worker. He busted his butt. And the owner of the company was really impressed with him. And what he did was, he said, instead of giving you a cash bonus for all your hard work, I'm going to give you some stock in the company. Okay, how does that work? Well, then he was absolutely stunned, pleasantly, when all of a sudden he started getting money in the mail. Because as the stock rose, he began getting dividends from the company, because that's what you do. You pay off the shareholders for their stake in the company. And he was like, this is way better than working. You just sit there and you got to type all this stuff out on a telegraph machine. That's hard work. And he said, this is how you make money. You invest in companies, you let them make money, and then you get paid. I was such an idiot. So what he does is he gets some capital together and he decides that he's going to start his own company. And he starts a steel company here in Pittsburgh. This is why, for those of you that are NFL fans. Pittsburgh Steelers, that's why, okay? Because Pittsburgh for a long time was the heart of the American steel production industry. So what he does, though, beyond that is, it's not a magic elixir. There are a lot of steel companies. Why does Carnegie wind up on top? He makes his company as efficient as possible. Because what you got to do is, steel doesn't just start out in Pittsburgh. You've got to buy it from these iron mines. These miners go down in Minnesota, for the most part. They dig it out of the ground. Then they float it across the Great Lakes. You got to pay the shipping companies to do that. And then he can turn it into steel in Pittsburgh. Then he's got to pay the railroad companies to get the steel girders out to all these people in these various other cities that want to make money. And then he's got to pay all the warehouse facilities in order to house them in these locales until people buy them. So whenever you do that, you're paying people to make a profit at every sort of point. The miners, they expect to make a profit. The flatboat people expect to make a profit. The railroad people expect to make a profit. The warehouse people need to make a profit, and you're going to be paying that profit. You're going to be paying that money. What would be way more efficient is if we eliminate all that, and I buy the mine, I buy the flatboat company, I buy the railroad, I buy the warehouse facilities, and I own all that. So all that profit that would have been paying somebody else, I'm going to keep that in-house, which means that I can lower my costs. He was able to deliver it to these consumers at a great deal less than his competitors. This is what we refer to as vertical integration. So from top to bottom of the business. For those of you who are movie fans, Jackie Chan does this. Like every part of a Jackie Chan movie is owned by Jackie Chan. Not just the actors, not just the production company, the film and the camera themselves, the trucks they drive around in, the costume company, the company that makes the soundtrack music for the movie and sells it to you, the people that that give the donuts to the actors and the crew. All that is owned by him, and it saves him a lot of money, which means we get 2 or 3 Jackie Chan movies a year. Carnegie does the same thing here, and he drove his competitors out of business, and then he's able to make hundreds of bazillions of dollars. He's rich, all right? In his later years, though, he became this major philanthropist. He gives over $350 million away to various charities. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Answer to that question is yes. Or no. I don't know, depending on what way you want to look at this. Sort of a thin Santa Claus. He's got kind of the Burl Ives thing going on with his little white beard action. But this is who he is. This is what he looks like. This official photograph. And this you might recognize. This is in New York City. This is Carnegie Hall. And this was donated to give young performing artists a chance to play in front of large audiences and get them a certain amount of fame and notoriety, because you don't really get to play the big rooms until you've achieved fame. But how do you achieve fame if almost nobody sees you play the piano or the violin or act or whatever it is performing arts people do? So Carnegie Hall is a place where you have to come in, or you can come in. You don't have to pay the hall rental fees and stuff like that. You just have to prove that you're talented, and people go in and watch these young performing artists and get their sort of start in life. Okay, the other example we're going to use is John D. Rockefeller. And unlike Carnegie, he's not going to be in the steel business. He's going to be in the oil business. He's also of poor birth. John D. Rockefeller doesn't take his family's fortune and use it to make more money. He starts with nothing. And eventually he's going to dominate the oil industry through what we refer to as the Standard Oil Company. You now know that company is the ExxonMobil company. So it's got a different name. It's been consolidated, put together several times. But it's the old Standard Oil Company. Rockefeller is going to use horizontal consolidation and integration. Unlike where Carnegie sort of buys up his whole chain, Rockefeller is going to concentrate a lot on putting his competition out of business. And the way that you would do that is you force them out or you buy them up. You come into some upstart oil company and you say, hey, listen, you guys can continue to compete with me, or here's $100,000, you guys can retire and go fishing every day. And a lot of these people, okay, that sounds really good. And they would sell their business to Rockefeller. Another way that he would do that is, as these people were competing too heavily with him, is he would lower the cost of his product to the point that he was actually losing money. But what that did was then people would buy his oil, and then the other companies that didn't have pockets as deep as his would go out of business, and then he could make it up later by jacking up the rates because he was the only game in town after that. Right? He also was pretty good. He was finding different ways and methods of refining oil, selling different products. He would sell the off-use products from this as paraffin wax for making candles. So he was very efficient with his business. And he also invented the idea of the trust. Okay? And that is where these people would sit on these interlocking directories. And so they all, of these boards of directors of these various companies, and so they all knew what they were charging. They all knew what they were paying their wages. And basically these members of the industry would work together instead of competing. And if that sounds kind of dishonest, that's because it's illegal today. And in fact, Rockefeller did a lot of good. He really massively expanded the American industry, gave a lot of people jobs. Overall, when you look at it from the point of view of the consumer, you say, well, he had a monopoly. He must have been really screwing the consumer. No, the cost of oil went through the floor because he had this massive national, and we'll see eventually worldwide, industry. All of a sudden, people who couldn't afford a drop of kerosene before, now they got kerosene lanterns all in their house. We're going to see eventually people that were motorists were able to afford gasoline and diesel for their cars. So it's this weird sort of mix of, on the one hand, he's got his business practices that he's using that are, one, now illegal, and two, even when Congress asked him about it, he lied. He lied to Congress about what he was doing. Or he at least obfuscated. He sort of covered this up. But we're going to see that this creates a massive worldwide economy of scale. It produces an enormous amount of wealth for the United States. You do have a good product at a decent price. It was available seemingly everywhere. So when you look at these corporations, they're on the one hand sort of reviled, but on the other hand, they're creating some massive opportunities for a lot of these people. Now, when we talk about wages here in a second, we are going to have to debunk a little bit of the mythology when we have to deal with fiscal policy of the United States government as a result of this. So, this is the Standard Oil Refinery in Richmond, California. This is what they would have looked like. This is a sort of massive oil city, as far as the eye can see with this. So when you think about how much oil they're refining, how much oil they're making, how much of this stuff they're creating such an efficient kind of scale, it makes a lot of sense why this product all of a sudden becomes available to a lot of people in a lot of places. All right. Well, a lot of the other industries, they look at Rockefeller's model for dominating the oil industry, and they're going to sort of Control-C, Control-V that into their own industries as well. Now, not everybody is going to be a Carnegie or a Rockefeller or a Vanderbilt where they can either buy up, control, or drive out their competitors. A lot of these other companies, they're all relatively equally sort of based in terms of the amount of cash they have, their market share, that kind of thing. And so when you look at some of these other industries, sugar, tobacco, leather, beef, salt, glass, some of the other ones, basically what they decided to do is consolidate themselves to work together through the trust system. And so what that did was they then had this monopoly where they could charge their own prices of whatever they wanted, they could pay their own wages, because you have a decrease of the market forces. This is also illegal today, so for those of you who want to try to do this. What this meant was, a lot of these industries, most of these industries here by 1900, they're controlled by a relatively few number of people. And they're given the nickname by the people that didn't like this system, the robber barons. And it's designed to kind of harken back to this medieval era where the peasants and the serfs and the workers in the town are forced to give the barons and the dukes and the lords all their riches and goods. And you can see in this political cartoon how that a lot of people felt they'd just been transported into the modern kind of era where you got these fat cat business leaders, a curious little mix of the medieval with the modern. The castle in the background is actually a factory, and instead of the peasants and the serfs, you've got the bank tellers and the farmers and the factory workers, all forced to give their taxes and wages, interest on a mortgage farm to these rich sort of fat cats as well. So this is how a lot of people sort of fell. Well, ever increasingly, these people are going to turn to the government to control monopolistic practices of a lot of these American business. Well, anytime the government tries to regulate business, it's like trying to nail jelly to the wall. Business moves a lot faster than the government does, all right? And the same thing is going to be true here in the 1890s. Congress in 1890 is finally going to respond with the Sherman Antitrust Act, all right? And they go, okay, we're getting together. Trusts are illegal. Yeah, trusts are illegal. Okay, all right, we'll vote on this. And basically any group that threatened trade, to set up a monopoly, that kind of thing, all right, we're going to pass this law, and so that way we'll get rid of this. All right, so hooray, we're done. But basically the law just kind of sat there, like the ugly girl at the dance, kind of off to the side. And nobody wanted to dance with her. Because the act, it had no teeth, it didn't have a strong enforcement arm, it had large loopholes, and in fact, by the time the Antitrust Act passed, a lot of these companies were using different methods than what the Act specified in order to achieve the same ends. They still had their monopolies. They just didn't use the trust. Oh, trusts are illegal? Okay, yeah. Well, we just won't use trusts anymore. And so they had quit doing this. So a lot of these trusts skirted the law. And the Act is basically going to sit there for 10 years. You've got business collaborating with ranking members of Congress and the government saying, well, listen, leave us alone. Because it's going to take somebody with a lot of political courage to come in and say, hey, I'm going to prosecute you people. And nobody's really going to want to do that. At least not until Teddy Roosevelt, who doesn't give a crap about anybody. So anyway, that's what is going to take place here. This is the Sherman Antitrust Act. Again, this is what legislation looks like when it fits on a single page. So there you go. Now, we looked at this kind of from the perspective of kind of a big view, what's going on economically. And then we looked on it from the perspective of, well, what are the business leaders? What are they doing? All right? Now we're going to flip it around and we're going to look at it from the bottom. We're going to look at it from the bottom up. All right? American workers during this period, they felt like they were really being preyed upon by the bosses. And part of this is due to the fact that through a lot of this period, their wages were lowered. All right? Now, I do have to stop and pause here for a second. Part of this is directly due to American, U.S. government's monetary policy. One of the things the United States government was very concerned about was inflation. There had been massive inflation during the Civil War because of the way that the government had tried to finance the war. That kind of thing happens. And so what you're going to see is following the Civil War, the United States government had followed a deflationary monetary policy to try to get the value of the money and the amount of money back to where it had been prior to the Civil War. So they're following a deflationary monetary policy, okay? As bad as inflation is, deflation is worse, okay? But the United States government is, like today, full of really, really stupid people. So what they're trying to do is deflate the currency. Now, when inflation happens, all right, your dollar loses value. You go to the store, and what you could buy for $1 one day, you come back the next day and it's $1.25. Same item, but it's inflation. It means your dollar has lost value, and it takes more dollars to buy the same thing. All right? Deflation is the opposite of that. Your dollar gains value. Well, hooray, right? The problem with this here is, let's say you're an employer, and if the government is following a deflationary monetary policy, and you pay somebody, let's say, $100 for a certain working period, like a month, whatever, and then you pay them again $100, if there's deflation going on, you've given them a raise. You know, well, no, you haven't. You paid them the same amount. No, the value of that money has gone up. So you're giving them more resources. You're giving them more wealth, even by not changing the amount of their wages. Okay? So what happens through a lot of this period here is a lot of these employers understand that. They're like, hey man, we're giving these people raises. In some cases, it was, in fact, the deflation was so bad that they were able to lower the wages, but when you factor in the deflation, it was still a raise for the worker. I know that seems, wait a minute, you're getting paid less money, but when you've got deflation, in some cases, a less dollar amount may actually still be more money, okay, for this. And so, you're never going to lower anybody's wages and try to convince them of deflationary monetary policy. It's just never going to work. Okay? It's just not going to happen. You cut somebody's wages, and they're going to flip the heck out. I've got less money. So that's what's going to happen. So in a lot of cases, though, the lowering of the wages was directly due to the American government's monetary policy. Like I said, U.S. government full of idiots. All right? Now, in some cases, the way that they got around this was by paying them only company money. You didn't get paid in U.S. dollars. You got paid in company bucks. Okay? And this, of course, could then be controlled by the company, because the only place that you could buy stuff from was the company store. Your clothes, your food, all that kind of stuff. And in some cases, they controlled your housing. You stayed in a house that was owned by the company, and you paid your rent directly back to the company. So the company's able to set all these prices. Now, there's a lot of debate about all this, whether or not, because a lot of companies felt, well, this is efficient. This is a good way to do this. This is a good way to avoid the wages problem with deflationary monetary policy. But a lot of people then felt, well, the government and the company controls every move that I make. You know, what money I have in my pocket, where I go, where I live, what I buy. One of the things that's pretty not arguable, though, is a lot of the working conditions that existed here were pretty horrible. Okay, some of these downright unsafe. We're going to see that a lot of children then feel like they're compelled to work in order to help their families get ahead. And you know what they're not doing when they're working? They're not going to school. So a lot of these people that work in coal mines or in textile mills, that's the only thing they're going to learn how to do, because they never learn anything else as their childhood. And of course, when layoffs happen, you can fire workers left and right. If you cause political problems for the boss, I don't think what you're doing is right. Well, you're fired. So this is something that really riles up a lot of the American workers. All right. Eventually, what you're going to do is the workers are going to have to form groups, because if you're tired of this crap, you walk in the boss's office. That's it, boss. Hey, you don't change all this stuff in here, I'm going to quit. Well, fine, you're fired. Get out. I can find another worker. It's not that big of a deal. Now, when you got a whole group of people that come in and say, hey, you need to make these changes or you're going to have to fire all of us, well, he may still do it. He may still fire all of you. But trust me, firing the entire factory full of workers requires a lot more consideration. Okay? And they would call these groups unions, labor unions. They're not a new idea. They're imported from these socialist groups in Europe. And in fact, a lot of these were European socialists escaping from the 1848 revolutions that bring this into the United States. And so this process of basically all of you going in and telling the boss what for, either through an intermediary or whatever, is called collective bargaining. All right? The number one weapon that these people have is the strike, right? Which is where we're going to quit working. All the union workers are going to quit. And there are various types of strikes. There's the just don't show up to work at all strike. There's the walkout strike, where you go in and you start the factory machinery, and then at a predetermined time you walk out. There's a sit-down strike, where you sit down, right? And then if you don't want to get totally fired, there's a slow-down strike, where you you're working, but you're just working a lot slower than usual. And so it's a good way to take money out of the boss's pocket with this one. Okay, so here you can see some of these industrial workers, what they look like here at one of these mills in the late 19th century. And I know a lot of you are saying, some of these kids live there are 15 years old. Yep, that's what's going on here with this as well. So child labor was pretty rampant. Some of these kids were actually pretty useful little workers, because their little hands will fit into these areas. Oh man, the machine's still going, and who's going to fit their arm under there to get the cog that fell down? There's a lot of whirring blades and stuff down there. Hey, little Timmy, your arm will fit under there. Now be careful, that stuff's sharp. So you got some pretty bad stuff here. There's a lot of people that, when they tell you, I worked my whole life, it is not terribly far off in that statement with this as well. This is the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, which is famous for the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. When we talk about the poor working conditions that existed here, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company made shirts, as you might have guessed from the name of the company. It employed an all-female workforce to do their work, and they're up here on one of the top floors of the building when a fire breaks out in one of the lower floors. Right? Now, for those of you who have never spent a lot of time in a tall building, when there's a fire, you go to the fire escape. All right? But the company really hadn't paid a lot of money to keep the fire escape up to code, and so it fell away from the heat of the fire. So these ladies are trapped on the top floor, and as the fire goes up, for those of you who've never spent a lot of time setting things on fire, fire goes up, and they've got now a choice, which is be human barbecue and find out the true meaning of snap, crackle, and pop, or learn to fly. And some of the women would choose choice A, and some of them would choose choice B. So you're going to have some of these women are going to go kersplat on the sidewalk outside. So it's pretty graphic, pretty gruesome, kind of stuff. That's taking, you can imagine you watch these people. Hey, look, that woman's on fire. Oh, look, she's falling down. So it's pretty stark, nasty kind of stuff. And there are a lot of companies that had a lot of safety, what would be now just egregious sort of safety violations. It's expensive to get the safety equipment. We don't really want to do that kind of stuff. And so here you can see an artist's rendition of what has happened. The boss here, you can see him, he's the grim sort of fellow in the top hat. He's just posted the new wages, which have gone down. And the workers are not too terribly excited about it. You can see that they've got themselves a spokesman who is, it's not fair, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, I don't care, I'm the rich boss. And you can see a lot of these guys are very worried. They're upset. They're running out of the mill. They're angry. And you can see off in the corner here that the wife and mother of some of these workers are very worried. What's going to happen? Are we going to get, are they going to get fired? Are they going to go on strike? Are they going to lose money? And you see the one guy, he's talking to his wife. His wife's like, don't cause any problems. Don't get fired, And then, of course, the one guy's like, I can solve this problem. He's picking up a rock. So, anyway, things are about to get ugly. And now when you look at some of these strikes, a lot of times when you see strikes happen on TV now, they're sort of ridiculous. These people, they kind of stand outside the business and they kind of walk around and they got these signs. They talk about, business is unfair to its workers. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's all a holdover from this, because when the workers would go on strike at these big factories, they had to surround the factory like a frickin' army besieging the castle. The reason for that was, what the owners were trying to do is break the strike. Oh, you guys all quit? I'm just going to go hire some more workers. And if he can get the workers, the new workers, the scabs, the replacement workers, into the factory and get them to restart the machinery, guess what? You guys have gone from on strike to unemployed. So there's a lot of hostile feelings here at a lot of these places where they would surround the entrances and they would make sure that none of these guys would be able to get replacement workers into the factory. And of course, when you've got large numbers of people that are highly emotional, it shouldn't surprise you that things get out of hand. Like I mentioned, these labor unions are going to form during and then following the Civil War, and that's going to bring them into conflict with these business leaders. One of the things that you've got to understand is it's not about money. It's not about money or safety or child labor or anything. It's a power relationship. Who controls the power in the industry? Is it the business leader, the manager, who's paid for the factory and opens it up and hires the workers, or is it the workers themselves who provide the labor? It's a power struggle for who's going to control what's going to take place. In some industries, the management has remained largely in charge. And in some industries, we've seen what happens when labor gets a strong hand in it. The American auto industry in a lot of places. You just look at Detroit, which looks like a bomb has gone off. Labor got control of that and has run it into the ground. Well, these unions, they would order these strikes and these walkouts to combat the owners that, you do what we say or we're going to strike. Yeah, whatever. You guys need the jobs. No, they're going to go on strike. Okay? Like I mentioned, the owners would hire these scabs or replacement workers to try to restart these factories, and strike breakers to beat up striking workers, in some cases to get them out of the way. And when I say beat them up, I mean beat them up. They're going to come in with baseball bats and tire irons, and eventually these strikes are going to turn into these violent riots. Some of them are going to involve a lot of gunplay. Now, it's going to shut down, in some cases, these industries. In some cases, it's going to shut down whole cities. It's going to get really ugly and violent. The most egregious of all these is the Great Strike of 1877, where you had the workers of the railroad industry feel like they're being mistreated, and so they go on strike. And when you think about it for just a second, wait a minute, if the railroad goes on strike, the entire economy goes on strike. Everything ran on the railroads by 1877. So you have a national economic meltdown, briefly, because the railroad workers go on strike. Okay? Now, when you look at this from the perspective of people who aren't in these labor unions, the American consumer, generally speaking, their views of the unions are very negative because they see them rioting, they see them causing problems. They go to the store and they'll be like, hey, I'd like to get some stuff here. We don't have any stuff here. Why not? Because the railroad workers are on strike, and so nothing can get to the store. So a lot of these people feel that these unions are actually causing a lot of problems from the economic shock and dislocation. And they also think that, and in part rightly so, that it's socialist influence from outside radicals that are helping cause this violence. And like I said, there's a certain amount of truth to that as well. This is one of these violent episodes that takes place here during the Great Strike of 1877. You got to think about it for just a second. How mad do you have to be to flip over a railroad car? I mean, those things would be heavy. So you can see the striking workers in the background, and you can see, of course, they called out the National Guard as they were firing rifles into them. And so it's pretty crazy. Stuff's on fire in the background. This is Cincinnati. This is a clash between striking workers and the state militia. These are dudes with rifles, and they're going at it hand to hand in the streets. You can imagine. You look outside and you see. Well, you're probably not thinking these striking workers. They really have a hard grievance. They're willing to go to the mat for their beliefs. They'd be like crazy radical people that are throwing bombs and causing problems, and now they're blowing out the glass windows of my tailor shop or whatever kind of business that they're running. In some cases, the workers would just set the factory on fire because, hey, if we're not going to have the jobs here and they hire replacement workers, well, then nobody's going to work here. So that's what takes place in some of these cases as well. This is one of the burned out factories that has been destroyed in the rioting that takes place with these strikes. So it's pretty crazy. Good example to use as a total kind of case study is Pullman. All right, Pullman is really indicative of the era. All right, now the Pullman company made luxury passenger rail cars. In the era before, if you were sort of wealthier than you knew what to do with all your money, before you had a great big yacht or a private plane, what you had was your own private passenger car. And what you would do is, when you and your rich, sort of snotty friends would get together and say, "Jiggers, Martha, what a wonderful spring. Let's go down to Florida." And say, "Oh, yes, Clive, that sounds wonderful. And let's ring up the office and have them attach our car." So what you do is you call down to the railroad yard, and they have your luxury passenger rail car in a little shed off by itself, and you paid the rent to have it in there, and then they would attach it to a train. And you would show up, and you get to sit in this luxury car, and it would have, a kitchen area, and it would have a little bunk area, and you have a little fun area where you can play cards, or I don't know, whatever it is rich people did for fun back in the late 19th century. So anyway, Pullman was the company that made those, all right? Just like Lear is the company that makes the fancy jets that people fly in Gulfstreams and stuff like that. Pullman was the one that made luxury passenger cars, and his factory was just south of Chicago. You could walk to it. I wouldn't advise it. It was a little far, but it was very easy to get to on the railroad line. All right. So he's trying to make his operation very, very efficient. And so what he did was he basically built an entire factory town. There was a whole town in Illinois near Chicago that he humbly named Pullman. Right. It must be nice to be able to name the whole town after yourself. All right. So you had the factory that made the cars, that made the railroad cars, and then you also had all the other stuff for the people to live there. You had their houses, you had their stores, you had their churches, you had their baseball fields. Theaters, all the whole stuff that you would have in town, it was all owned by Pullman, and he controlled the whole thing. So for those of you who think about it, though, for a second, it does sound efficient. But what if your boss, that person, okay, was also your landlord and ostensibly the head of your church, ran the store where you bought all the stuff, and basically ran everything in your whole town. So he's the mayor of your city. I just described one of your worst nightmares you ever had, right? And Pullman, for himself, he was something of a social engineer. He wanted a tightly controlled city that was clean and was very well run, and the people there were ethical, and they didn't do this. And so he banned a lot of things. No loitering or drinking outside. You couldn't do that kind of stuff. The streets had to be clean. They all were the same. He used the company currency. You were paid in Pullman dollars, and you were paid at Pullman stores. And so that was, you paid Pullman stores money for whatever you wanted to buy, okay? Well, what you're going to see is the workers grow tired of all this company control, basically, of their lives from top to bottom. And finally, in 1894, they're going to go on strike, all right? The strike is extremely bloody and had to be suppressed by the National Guard. It spreads into the southern part of Chicago. It gets really out of hand. The federal government has to get involved. And so, let's do it backwards. This is Pullman. If you've ever read one of those sci-fi novels where like this giant sort of brain controls everything and all the houses are the same and all the streets are the same and people walk the same and they blink at the same time, that reminds me of what the picture when I look at Pullman. It is freaky how homogeneous it is. I mean, there's just no variation in it. The streets are wonderful and clean here in Pullman. Life here is grand. I mean, it's creepy kind of stuff when you look at it. And you see how this would drive people eventually to be crazier than an outhouse rat. And so that's what's going to happen to these guys. They're going to go on strike. They're going to not like what's going on there monetarily. They're going to not like what's going on there with the controls. And eventually they're going to go on strike. And you'll notice that there are dudes riding on the trains with guns. Okay? Some people are going to get shot. Some people are going to get beaten to death. It's really, really ugly. And eventually the strike has to be suppressed. So that is going to bring our discussion here of expansion of American industry in the late 19th century.